Hey guys, tonight we begin with something extremely mellow. So go ahead, dim the lights, find the softest corner of your pillow, and settle in. We're floating into the ancient Nubian desert, which is already relaxing just to imagine endless sand, long horizons, the occasional palm tree pretending it means something, and somewhere in all that, a few quietly overworked potters trying to keep their clay from melting into a sad beige puddle. Tonight's story moves slowly. Very slowly. Desert walk level slow. Because we're looking at how Nubian potters somehow kept their kilns cool in the middle of unbearable desert winds that wanted to roast everything alive. And yes, it sounds like the kind of mystery you only think about when you're half asleep, and that's exactly the vibe here. So let's drift into it. The thing about ancient Nubia, especially the lower and middle Nubian kingdoms, is that surviving the climate was basically the whole job description of being alive. There were kings, queens, scribes, warriors, but honestly, the real heroes were anyone managing not to burst into flames by noon. And potters ranked high on that list. Not the glamorous sort of artisans, like goldsmiths crafting jewelry for petty royals who wanted to look intimidating in portraits. No, potters were the please just keep the storage jars from collapsing so we don't all starve type. Much more practical, much more dusty, and somehow much more peaceful. If you've ever looked at Nubian pottery, and let's be honest, you probably haven't unless you've been dragged through a museum by someone who reads every plaque, you'll notice something. The surfaces are smooth in a way that feels deliberate. The colors shift from deep reds to dark browns with a kind of quiet confidence. A lot of that beauty came from a weirdly subtle technique, controlling the temperature inside kilns when the outside world was absolutely committed to chaos. Desert winds weren't just strong. They were dramatic. They showed up uninvited, messed up the airflow, and threatened to crack every pot into useless shards. An ancient potter's worst nightmare, right after running out of water and customers complaining that their beer jars are too lopsided. So the key problem of the day was, how do you run a kiln without it overheating or cooling unevenly? You're surrounded by sand, wind, and a sun that has no chill. The answer wasn't to build bigger kilns, or to hide underground like a grumpy desert tortoise, although honestly, that might have helped. No, Nubian potters used airflow tricks so elegant and understated that modern engineers would nod politely and pretend they already knew that. Let's ease into one of those tricks. Picture a kiln, not a giant industrial thing, but a clay oven about the size of someone who never skipped leg day. The inside needed to reach high temperatures for firing pottery, but not so high that the clay warped into abstract art, which was not yet invented and certainly not appreciated. So potters built kilns with small vents, lined in certain directions, angled just so. These vents did more than let smoke escape. They invited desert winds into the kiln, not with enthusiasm, but with a kind of controlled, okay, but behave yourself, energy. It was all about cross drafts, cooling by airflow, using wind not as an enemy, but as a reluctant coworker you tolerate because they actually get things done. But even cross drafts weren't enough. The desert wind was unpredictably moody. One moment it was soft. The next, it was basically trying to peel your skin off. So potters added a second strategy, burying the sides of the kiln partially in the ground. Just enough to stabilize temperature. Not enough to make you wonder if they were trying to hide from something. This created insulation, using the earth itself as a giant, naturally chill refrigerator. It worked surprisingly well. The ground absorbed excess heat, the vents encouraged gentle airflow, and the pots inside cooked at a slow, steady pace, like a patient stew. But kiln engineering wasn't the only part of the process. Nubian potters also paid far too much attention to clay, specifically where it came from and how much organic material was mixed into it. Clay with tiny bits of plant matter actually cooled slower and more evenly. Imagine the potter equivalent of adding oats to your diet because someone told you it helps regulate things. Same idea here, but for jars. Let's drift over to one particular potter. Let's call him someone thoroughly average, because grand heroes are not on the menu tonight. Call him Mary. A man whose daily routine was probably 90% waiting for clay to dry and 10% complaining about the heat. A man whose entire job depended on outsmarting wind. Mary would wake before sunrise, when the air was still tolerable, and shuffle to the clay pits. These pits were usually near the Nile, because even in Nubia, you needed water to make mud behave. He'd check the clay texture by smushing lumps between his fingers, making faces like he was judging a cooking show. He'd mix in the right proportion of sand. Yes, more sand, because apparently there wasn't enough around already. This reduced shrinkage during firing, which in pottery terms is a big deal. Then, after shaping his pieces, cups, bowls, tall storage jars that always looked slightly annoyed, he'd let them dry in the shade. Direct sunlight would crack them before they even reached the kiln. So potters built little reed shelters to block the sun. These shelters looked like they had zero architectural effort put into them, but they worked. By noon, the wind picked up. It always did. A kind of hot, restless breeze sweeping over the desert like it forgot something important. This was Mary's least favorite coworker. But instead of complaining too much, he used the wind to fuel his kiln's perfectly imperfect airflow. He lit the kiln with dried brushwood and dung. Yes, dung. Every ancient civilization used dung as fuel because it was free and literally everywhere. Rich people had oil lamps. Potters had flaming piles of what came out of animals. Life is unfair like that. As the fire heated the kiln, the desert wind approached the vents. If it blew too hard, Mary covered certain openings with clay slabs. If it died down, he opened them. It was like managing a choir of invisible, badly behaved musicians, trying to get them to hit the right notes without starting a wildfire. And all this subtle management kept the interior temperatures surprisingly stable. This is why Nubian pottery has such a signature look, a kind of controlled gradient from warm reds to smoky blacks, caused by shifting oxygen levels during firing. It wasn't randomness. It wasn't luck. It was airflow artistry. Of course, Mary didn't think about it in poetic terms. He just wanted the pots not to explode. Exploding pots were expensive, loud, and humiliating. If one shattered, the whole kiln might go out of balance and ruin the batch. So he hovered around the oven all afternoon, pretending he wasn't sweating through his entire existence, adjusting vents like someone very determined to avoid a pottery-related meltdown. Let's float over to another detail people forget about. Pottery wasn't just household stuff. It was cultural identity. Nubian communities decorated their pottery with patterns, wavy lines, dotted borders, geometric shapes that looked like the ancestors of modern minimalist design. Royal households in the region even had special ceramics that looked more refined. Because even in ancient Nubia, elites wanted luxury versions of everything. They were the kind of people who'd walk into a potter's workshop and go, "Do you have this in a slightly darker shade of brown?" Meanwhile, Mary would be nodding politely while internally thinking, "No, it's mud. It is brown." But royalty had their quirks. Queens of Kush, for example, often commissioned funerary pottery to accompany them into the afterlife. These pieces were meant to be symbolic offerings. A sort of, "Here's a jar, please let me pass peacefully." And if the pottery cracked? Well, that was a bad omen. Not terrible, just mildly inconvenient. Sort of like showing up to a meeting with a coffee stain on your shirt. You survive, but you're annoyed. So the pressure was there. Potters like Mary weren't just making dishes for common households. They were occasionally supplying elites with items that were supposed to help them spiritually transition to better real estate in the next world. No pressure at all. Now let's drift toward another aspect of these kilns. They were often built in clusters. A small pottery district might have 5 or 6 kilns, each maintained by different families. This created a neighborhood atmosphere where everyone monitored each other's smoke plumes like nervous suburban parents watching their lawns during fireworks season. If someone's kiln went too hot, the others would know. If a fire got too big, everyone panicked politely. Cooperation was essential. Fire was useful, but also extremely enthusiastic about burning down the entire village. Families passed down pottery knowledge, not in books, because those were rare, but through long, repetitive, soothing instructions. You learned by watching. You learned by touching clay until your hands understood it better than your brain. You learned airflow by standing beside kilns for so long you could practically sense temperature shifts through instinct. And somehow, generation after generation, Nubian potters kept producing consistent, beautiful ceramics in a climate that seemed actively hostile to the idea of consistent anything. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. But it was steady and strangely elegant. Let's ease into the final part of tonight's chapter, how these cooling techniques influenced regional trade. Nubia wasn't an isolated world. It traded with Egypt to the north, with sub-Saharan regions to the south, even with nomadic groups sweeping through the desert like half-hearted tumbleweeds. And pottery was one of its most recognizable exports. People liked Nubian pots because they were sturdy. They didn't warp as easily. They held liquids. They looked nicer than average. All because potters knew how to temper their kilns against the wind. Egyptians sometimes copied these methods, quietly without giving credit, because that's how larger kingdoms often behave. They would study a Nubian pot, see how evenly it was fired, and wonder, why can't ours look this stable? The answer, of course, was airflow. But explaining desert airflow techniques to Egyptians was probably like explaining Wi-Fi to your cat. So Nubian pottery earned a reputation: calm, consistent, and resilient. Everything the script is trying to be. And that's why their kiln cooling methods mattered. Not because they were groundbreaking. Not because they were dramatic. But because they were quiet solutions to quiet problems, keeping communities afloat one well-fired jar at a time. Chapter 2. Kiln neighbors, dusty rivalries, and the slow art of not letting clay collapse. If you picture a Nubian pottery district, you might imagine something dramatic. Rows of kilns blazing like miniature volcanoes, artisans shouting instructions, apprentices running around with baskets of clay like nervous meerkats. But the truth was much slower, much calmer. It was more like a quiet cluster of low-domed structures, half buried in sand, surrounded by people who had long accepted that dust was their primary personality trait. Kilns sat in small groups, positioned at angles that made sense only if you understood local winds. Most of the potters insisted they did. Some definitely did not. But everyone pretended they did, because pottery was a long-term reputation game, and nothing was worse than being known as the potter whose kiln kept belching smoke like it had emotional problems. The potters weren't exactly competitive, but there were rivalries, soft, friendly ones, the kind built on decades of watching your neighbor burn half a batch and trying not to smirk about it. People joked that you could tell which family fired what type of pottery just by looking at the coloration. One household tended toward darker gradients because their kiln vents were slightly too narrow. Another produced lighter hues because they obsessed, quietly, over airflow to the point of rearranging their vents every other season. No one acknowledged these obsessions openly, but everyone noticed. Take our friend Mary from earlier. He worked in a neighborhood with two other small kiln groups. To the west was Heckennefer, the kind of potter who believed every problem could be solved by adding more clay. Too thin? Add clay. Too sandy? Add clay. Kiln overheated? Somehow, his answer was still add clay. Nobody had the heart to tell him this was not a coherent philosophy. But strangely enough, it worked for him most days. His pots were thick, slightly too thick, like they were designed for someone who didn't trust water not to evaporate out of thinner walls. But they were durable. People liked durable. Then to the east was a family of potters who worked with almost surgical precision. They carved tiny decorations with reeds, scratched fine lines that looked like the desert wind had done the detailing for them. Their kiln was known for its incredibly even temperature. Not because they were geniuses, but because the oldest grandmother in the family refused to let anyone else handle the vents. She would sit on a stool outside the kiln, leaning on a worn walking stick, moving clay covers with a rhythm only she understood. She never raised her voice, never hurried, and never accepted help. Everyone quietly suspected she could hear the kiln the way a shepherd hears sheep, a kind of sixth sense for pottery. Meanwhile, Mary just tried not to let his kiln embarrass him. It was an average kiln, maybe even slightly below average if you were feeling honest. But he had patience, a trait more valuable than perfect architecture. He didn't rush the firing process. And firing was really the quiet heart of pottery, hours upon hours of sitting, watching shadows shift across the ground, adjusting vents with the kind of calm resignation a person develops when they accept the desert will never compromise. Let's drift slowly into the details of how a firing cycle worked. Potters didn't fill the kiln with flames right away. First came preheating. This involved slowly building warmth inside the chamber so the moisture in the clay evaporated without cracking. Was the pottery equivalent of warming up before exercise. If you skipped it, your pots shattered like dramatic fainting nobles. So Mary began each firing by adding small amounts of kindling, brushwood, dried grasses, and the ever-reliable dung cakes shaped by the livestock owners who definitely deserved more credit for their contributions to ancient craft technology. The point was to heat the kiln gradually, a process so dull it was almost meditative. You sat. You waited. You stared at the ground. You occasionally poked the fire. You tried not to fall asleep leaning against the kiln because that was how people lost eyebrows. After the kiln reached a comfortable warm state, not too hot, not too cool, basically the Goldilocks of ancient oven management, Mary would add stronger fuel. He arranged it carefully inside the firing chamber, leaving gaps so the fire breathed evenly. People today forget that ancient kilns were not roaring infernos. They were controlled environments. Fire wasn't a wild beast to be unleashed. It was a somewhat stubborn pet to be coaxed. Let's drift toward the wind now. Desert winds were not simply wind. They had personalities. Morning breezes were cooperative, light, predictable. Afternoon winds were restless, sweeping in from the north or northeast depending on the season. Sometimes they carried sand. Sometimes they carried more sand. Occasionally they carried gossip from neighboring villages if you were feeling poetic. Potters learned to read these winds with casual familiarity. Mary could tell what kind of firing day it would be just by how his hair moved when he stepped outside. If the wind tugged at his headcloth like a rude child, he knew he'd be covering vents more than usual. If it barely moved, he'd brace himself for heat retention issues. This wind-reading skill passed down through generations not because it was glamorous, but because it was necessary. And it came with its own quiet humor. Older potters often claimed they could feel the wind in their bones. Younger potters quietly suspected that was just age talking. But they nodded politely anyway because you didn't question the people who taught you how not to explode clay. While firing continued through the hot afternoon, the neighborhood became a kind of shared waiting room. Families walked around with water jars balanced on their heads. Children drew patterns in the sand that vanished within minutes. Herd owners drove goats past the pottery yards. Occasionally, a curious animal wandered too close to the kilns, sniffed the heat, and backed away as if offended. Mary used the waiting time to smooth lids, finish polish on unfired bowls, or carve simple dotted motifs onto larger jars. These patterns weren't elaborate, just little details that made his pieces recognizable. Some dots represented flowing water. Some symbolized fields. Some were probably random decoration done out of boredom, but buyers liked to pretend everything had deep meaning. And of course, as he worked, he kept watch on the kiln, adjusting vents, shifting fuel, listening for subtle changes in the fire's crackle. Too loud meant oxygen was rushing in too quickly. Too muffled meant the kiln might be suffocating. The perfect middle ground sounded like a calm, steady breath. Let's drift to something often overlooked: cooling down. Once firing finished, the kiln couldn't just be opened. That was the fastest way to ruin the entire batch. Sudden exposure to cool desert air cracked pots instantly. So cooling was a controlled, gradual process, sometimes even more delicate than the firing itself. Potters sealed the vents, covered the kiln mouth, let heat escape only through the tiny gaps naturally left in the clay structure. It could take hours, sometimes a full day. During this time, potters walked around quietly as if the kiln needed peace to recuperate. No one said that out loud, of course, but everyone understood it. Even children knew not to run around yelling near a cooling kiln. You just didn't risk it. Cooling kilns created a soft radiating warmth in the evenings. That's when neighbors often gathered nearby, sitting on the sand and talking about the river, or the harvest, or how someone's cousin had accidentally tipped an entire load of pottery into the Nile last week. People pretended not to laugh, but they remembered it fondly. These gatherings had their own subtle rivalries too, like when someone would comment on how evenly another family's pots turned out. It was said casually, but everyone knew it was a compliment weighted with years of observation. No potter openly bragged, they just let the pottery speak for itself. Let's drift to a particularly sleepy subject: clay sources. Different clay pits produced different textures. Some clay was smoother and produced refined pottery. Other sources yielded grittier material better for larger vessels. Potters knew them all like old acquaintances. One pit near Mary's village produced clay so fine it felt like wet flour. Another pit produced clay so sandy it was like shaping dough filled with tiny attitude problems. Potters chose their sources based on what they needed: storage jars, cooking pots, serving bowls. Occasionally, traders arrived from neighboring villages with clay samples, trying to convince locals to buy their material. They often exaggerated its quality, describing it as silky, perfect, or gifted by the gods. Potters nodded politely and tested a small lump. If it cracked during drying, that was the end of the conversation. Traders always pretended not to notice. Let's float gently into kiln repair. Kilns weren't permanent structures. Heat cracked the outer layers over time. Sandstorms wore down walls. Even well-built kilns needed seasonal maintenance. Potters patched cracks with fresh clay, sometimes mixing in straw or chaff to keep it reinforced. They smoothed the repairs with practiced hands, making the kiln look like it had never aged a day, even though everyone knew it was older than half the village. Kiln repair days were oddly social. Families helped each other. Children fetched water. Elderly potters gave unsolicited advice about brick placement. And for a few hours, it felt like the entire community revolved around the simple task of keeping a dome of clay intact. A tiny reminder that even in ancient Nubia, infrastructure was a group effort. Now, let's ease into pottery finishing techniques. Nubian pottery often had a burnished surface, smooth and glossy. This wasn't magic. It was elbow grease. Potters rubbed the surface of dried but unfired clay with stones, wooden tools, or even old pottery shards. The friction polished the surface. It also strengthened the walls by compressing the clay particles. A practical technique disguised as decoration. Burnishing sessions were long, slow, repetitive. Exactly the sort of activity that puts modern museum visitors to sleep if they ever watched it in real time. But for potters, it was peaceful. A moment when hands moved automatically, smoothing surfaces in quiet circles. The final result was pottery that reflected light gently, with a soft sheen that made even simple bowls feel dignified. Let's float into evening now. After a day of managing fire, airflow, and clay temper, potters ended their work when the sky shifted colors, from muted gold to dusty rose to deep blue. Evening winds were cooler and less aggressive. People wrapped themselves in linen shawls, sat outside their homes, and waited for the heat of the day to finally release its grip. Sometimes the neighborhood shared a pot of beer, mild, thick, and more like liquid bread than anything. Other times, people simply drifted home to rest their feet and their patience. Potters slept early because the next day required them to wake before the sun had fully decided whether it wanted to cooperate. And through it all, the kilns cooled. Slowly, quietly. Tomorrow, the pots would be removed, examined, admired, sold, traded, or occasionally thrown aside when a crack revealed itself like a tiny insult. But that was all part of the rhythm. Creation, firing, cooling, reflection. A steady cycle. A calm one. A process shaped by wind, clay, patience, and a few stubborn artisans who mastered the art of not letting their pottery collapse under pressure, literal or figurative. Chapter 3. The quiet politics of clay, river moods, and the strange prestige of potters. Among all the crafts in ancient Nubian life, pottery looked the least political. You would assume potters simply shaped clay, fired it, sold it, and minded their own dusty business. But nothing in human history is ever that simple. Even pottery had its social layers, its tiny tensions, its slow-paced drama. The kind of drama that never escalated beyond a raised eyebrow or a pointed comment about someone's kiln design. But still, drama. The prestige of pottery shifted depending on the period. In some kingdoms, potters were seen as essential artisans whose work kept households functioning. In others, They were treated as skilled laborers who quietly floated between merchant and craft ranks. Either way, pottery was woven into the economy so thoroughly that no ruler, no matter how glamorous, over-perfumed, or overly concerned with gold, could ignore it. This meant potters had a certain low-key influence. Not political influence, exactly. More like, if a potter stopped working, the entire village became very thirsty very quickly. Water needed jars. Beer needed jars. Grain needed jars. If there was no jar, there was no storage. And if there was no storage, people had to carry things in baskets, which looked rustic in an aesthetic sense but were terrible for keeping liquids where liquids belonged. So potters had social currency. The quiet kind. Everyone treats you nicely because they need a large storage vessel by next moon and nobody wants it to be lopsided kind. Let's drift into how this played out in daily life. When traders came through the village, they often bartered for pottery before anything else. Not spices, not textiles, not grain. Pottery. Because without good jars, no one could transport the rest of their goods safely. Traders needed amphorae with thick bases, narrow necks, and strong rims. They needed jugs that could survive being strapped to donkeys who didn't care about artisanal craftsmanship. And they needed bowls that stacked neatly without wobbling, because a wobbly stack was a sign of a potter who rushed their shaping, and nobody wanted to be the trader known for crooked wares. This gave potters bargaining power. Quiet bargaining power, but power nonetheless. A trader might haggle ruthlessly over grain prices, but when it came to pots, they softened. They used phrases like, "We appreciate your craft," or "This is very fine work," even when they absolutely did not mean it. Potters smiled politely anyway. Compliments were currency, even the insincere ones. Let's drift to the river now. The Nile was the lifeline of Nubia. But it was also moody. Seasonal floods determined everything. Harvests, travel, fishing, and yes, pottery production. High floods brought fine silt, perfect for certain kinds of clay. Low floods exposed gritty riverbeds, which produced tougher but less refined pottery material. Potters adjusted. They learned to work with whatever clay the river generously threw at them, like a half-attentive friend giving gifts based on mood. Some years, the clay from the riverbanks was so fine that potters produced elegant cups with thin walls that felt almost fragile. Other years, the clay was coarse enough that potters shrugged and said, "Well, these will be cooking pots then," because coarse clay was ideal for pots placed directly over fire. They didn't crack as easily under thermal shock, making them perfect for boiling soups, stews, and whatever hearty meals kept families going during long summers. And of course, the river controlled the availability of fuel as well. Dried driftwood appeared on shores after floods. Reeds were easier to harvest during certain seasons. Even dung availability shifted depending on grazing cycles of local herds. Everything was interconnected. Every pot was a quiet negotiation between wind, water, earth, sun, and a potter's mood. Speaking of moods, let's ease into a particular subject: reputation. Potter reputations spread in ways that were soft but persistent. Villagers didn't keep written reviews. They kept memory-based reviews, which were somehow even harsher. If someone bought a jar that cracked, they remembered it for years. They told relatives, cousins, friends, anyone vaguely listening. Sometimes even strangers sitting nearby at the well. And word traveled. A potter with too many cracked pots became a cautionary tale. Someone mothers referenced when telling their children to be patient. Don't rush your work or you'll end up like, followed by a name everyone politely avoided mentioning around the potter in question. But on the other hand, potters who produced consistent work gained slow admiration. Merchants remembered them. Households preferred their bowls. Priests requested ritual vessels from them. A good reputation accumulated like layers of clay on a wheel, thin, gradual, building shape only with time. Let's drift back to Mary's neighborhood for a moment. One afternoon, a caravan from a northern settlement arrived looking for pottery. Their journey had not been kind. Half their jars had cracked in the heat. The remaining ones smelled faintly of something that was supposed to be beer but had fermented into a more experimental substance. The caravan leader, an older man whose eyebrows clearly had independent opinions from the rest of his face, looked at Mary's display of newly fired pots. He picked up one jar, tapped it with his knuckles, listened, tapped again. It was a ritual every trader performed, even though most traders had no idea what they were listening for. Something about sound quality, whether it resonated, or maybe they just liked tapping things. Mary stood quietly, not interrupting the tapping ceremony. Finally, the trader nodded. A slow, approving nod that said, "This pot won't betray me on the road." The trader bought 5 jars, then 7 more, then asked, very casually, whether Mary planned to make larger vessels next season. That was how reputations grew, quietly, gently, through tapping rituals and nods. Now, let's float into pottery usage in everyday life. Most households owned multiple pots. Some for cooking, some for water, some for grain, some for fermenting beer, and some for ceremonial uses, pouring offerings, storing sacred oils, holding incense. Cooking pots were dark and sturdy. They sat directly in fire pits, absorbing heat until their bottoms blackened. Water jars were tall and narrow, designed to keep water cool through evaporation. Grain jars were wide and heavy with tight lids to keep insects out. Beer jars had rounder bellies because the fermentation process needed room to bubble and sulk. Each pot had a role. Each role had rules. And everyone knew them. You didn't use a water jar for beer. You didn't use a cooking pot for storing grain. Not unless you wanted your kitchen to smell like an uncertain apocalypse. This specialization meant potters needed to understand household rhythms intimately. They needed to know which shapes sold well, which ones tended to break, and which households needed replacements because someone accidentally tipped over a jar during a clumsy moment they insisted was not their fault. And quietly, this made potters part of the social fabric. They weren't wealthy. They weren't elite. But they were deeply, calmly necessary. Let's drift into ritual pottery now. In temples, pottery carried offerings: milk, beer, water, incense. Priests performed rituals using specialized vessels that were decorated more neatly than everyday pots. Some had red and black gradients. Others had incised lines. A few were painted with simple motifs representing gods, ancestors, or, occasionally, a bird that looked slightly judgmental. These ritual pots were made with extra care. Smoother surfaces, finer clay. Even the firing process was more controlled. No distractions. No rushed fuel additions. Ritual pots had to be symmetrical, balanced, respectful. Priests often commissioned them directly. They visited potters, explained the needs, described the ceremony, and then stood uncomfortably long watching the potter shape the clay, offering commentary that was absolutely not needed. Potters nodded politely, but internally, they knew exactly what they were doing. If a ritual pot came out perfectly, the priest praised the gods. If it cracked, the priest sighed and said it was a sign. The potter also sighed, but for entirely different reasons. Let's drift into something vaguely glamorous: elite households. Elites didn't use ordinary pottery. That would have been far too logical. Instead, they ordered pieces that were polished to a shine, decorated with precise lines, and shaped elegantly. They wanted vessels that conveyed status, jars that implied wealth, bowls that whispered, "This household has enough free time to care about aesthetics." Of course, elites rarely understood the pottery process. They made requests like, "Make the pot taller, but thinner, but sturdier, but lighter." Potters listened, then produced something reasonable because physics still existed. Sometimes elites requested colors that simply were not possible with local clay. A queen once asked for a pot as blue as the river at dawn. The potter nodded, said he would consult the spirits of clay, and then made a normal pot because that was all clay spirits could manage. But elites appreciated the effort. They paid well, and occasionally gifted potters leftover food from festivals, which was how some craftsmen tasted luxury for the first time: day-old meat, slightly stale bread, and pomegranate seeds that looked fancier than they tasted. Let's drift into apprenticeships. Pottery was usually taught within families, but occasionally an apprentice came from another household, especially if they showed early talent. Talent didn't mean producing perfect pots. Talent meant patience. A child who could sit beside a kiln for hours without wandering off to chase goats was considered promising. Apprentices learned slowly. They began by collecting clay, carrying fuel, separating sand, kneading clay with their feet while singing repetitive work songs. Then they learned shaping, first making small beads, then tiny cups, then larger bowls. Only after years of consistent practice were they trusted with jars, which required balance, strength, and humility. And finally, they learned firing, the sacred part of pottery, the part that turned clay from fragile softness to solid strength. Apprenticeship in firing took longest because mistakes were visible to everyone. A cracked jar was a public lesson. A successful firing was quiet satisfaction. Let's drift toward the end of this chapter. By evening, the pottery district settled into its steady rhythm again. Kilns cooled. Neighbors chatted. Children drew patterns in the sand. The Nile reflected starlight like it was collecting secrets. And potters rested their hands. Not dramatically, not ceremonially, just quietly, knowing tomorrow they would gather more clay, shape more forms, manage more wind, and continue the slow, steady tradition that shaped their communities. A tradition built on patience and the incredibly calm art of not rushing anything, because rushing never made good pots. If we settle back into the slow, sandy rhythm of Nubia again, we can drift towards something delightfully ordinary. A small cluster of potters who, according to the archaeological residue left behind, seemed to spend an unreasonable amount of time just talking to their clay. Not literally, of course. At least, we don't have transcripts. But their workshop layouts and discard pits tell a story of people who worked with a quiet, meditative patience. The same patience you'd need when the desert wind kept trying to blast your face with powdered misery every morning. The workshop floor in these communities was usually swept smooth. Not because anyone was obsessively neat, but because fine sand gets into wet clay like sandpaper into socks. Every footprint had the potential to ruin a vessel wall, especially when the clay was thin. And Nubian potters liked thin walls. They had enough thick walls in their actual houses. They didn't need them in their cups too. So the potters pressed their tools into baskets or wooden trays, cleaned the surface with a palm leaf broom, and then settled into the slow shaping session that could last half the morning. The kiln would only come into play later, after everything had dried to that slightly leathery stage potters call good enough, I guess. Let's float over to another detail that gets missed: clay preparation. Nubian clays were often mixed with organic temper like straw or chaff. But potters weren't adding this because it made them feel rustic and artisanal. They added it because they had to. Pure clay shrinks as it dries, cracking like someone trying to smile after putting on a face mask that's too tight. Add chaff, though, and the shrinkage slows. So the potters needed clay with softened plant fibers, probably chatting while doing it, which sounds peaceful unless you picture someone's hands getting pricked by half-dried stalks on a hot day. The kneading process itself usually took longer than shaping the pot. And because they were working in small, household-adjacent workshops rather than big industrial facilities, everyone in the family probably knew the rhythm of the kneading. The sound of hands squishing into pliable clay. The low conversations. The slight thump of someone adjusting sitting mats or shifting a grinding stone. The domestic soundscape wrapped the workshop. Once pieces were shaped and set out, the desert did what it always did: dried everything at a speed that potters alternately loved and hated. If they put things out too early in the day, the wind could whip across the surfaces and create ridges, cracks, or lopsided drying patterns. If they waited too late, the evening temperatures slowed things down. So they timed it just right. Or at least, just right, according to centuries of inherited trial and error wisdom they never bothered to write down, because they had better things to do, like trying to keep their water jars cool. Now, the real charm comes from the firing day. Imagine dawn. The sky is wide and pale, the sun stretching upward like it isn't fully awake yet. Kilns are loaded slowly. No rush. Potters know the desert will rush everything later, so this moment is the calm before the heat. They stacked pots using that method that always looks dangerous to outsiders, placing fragile vessels rim to rim, side to side, leaning against one another like a pottery trust fall. A potter could usually tell if the stack was good by tapping the uppermost vessel. A soft, even vibration meant stability. A weird wobble meant someone had created a setup that would collapse into a terracotta avalanche. They fixed it. No one wanted to hear the dreaded crash mid-firing. When the kiln was finally filled, they sealed its mouth with clay or bricks. This was the part that always struck early travelers as strange. In some communities, potters left a small peephole. In others, they didn't bother, relying instead on listening. Firing pots by sound is a real thing. The crackling of burning wood, the muted thuds as internal moisture escaped, and the gradual shift in the pitch of the kiln's hum told potters almost everything. Some archaeologists argue that the best potters in Nubia probably had hearing like musicians. A firing session could last hours, and every sound meant something. That's why shouting children were probably shooed away. No one wants the kiln to sound like it's complaining. Eventually, the kiln reached peak heat. Not blazing, not screaming hot like industrial ovens, but the Goldilocks level of heat needed for durable wares. This was when potters employed clever wind management again. A turn of a clay plug, a small brick adjustment, or a cloth panel repositioned near the windbreak wall changed the airflow. The goal? To keep the heat circulating, not escaping like a visitor who suddenly remembered they left a pot boiling at home. Through the long firing hours, potters kept a calm atmosphere. They didn't fuss or pace or hover. They watched the flames sometimes, because flames are mesmerizing whether it's ancient Nubia or your cousin's backyard barbecue. But mostly they waited. Waiting was part of the craft. And in that waiting, a kind of community quiet formed. Maybe they sifted sand. Maybe they exchanged mild gossip. Nothing dramatic, because dramatic gossip can travel farther than a desert wind, and no one wanted that. Mostly they remained still. When evening approached, the kiln cooled slowly. Opening it too early risked thermal shock. The pottery equivalent of jumping from a sauna into an ice bath and instantly regretting every life choice that brought you to that point. So they let it rest, and themselves as well. They might have shared food, flatbread, dried dates, maybe leftover lentil porridge, and basked in the satisfaction of a day's work completed without any pottery casualties. Once they finally cracked the kiln open, the inside glowed with fading heat. Potters checked each vessel by tapping it lightly. A sharp, clear ring meant success. A dull thud meant disappointment. But even the failed pots weren't wasted. They were tossed into the discard pit, where archaeologists thousands of years later would marvel at them like they were clues to some lost cosmic secret, instead of what they actually were: broken dishes. But we're not done drifting. Because Nubian potters weren't just pot makers. They were also repairers. Vessels that cracked but didn't break apart entirely were patched with resin or sewn with small drilled holes threaded with plant fibers. People today will throw away a mug if it chips. Nubian households would have kept repairing a jar until it looked like it had survived 3 wars and a divorce. Each repaired vessel carried stories. Literally, as many households used distinctive clay mixes that left a visible grain and color. A neighbor could borrow a jar, return it chipped, and the potter repairing it would know exactly whose jar it was. Which might have led to some wonderfully passive-aggressive conversations. Come, of course, but still passive-aggressive. Pius, this is your jar. I knew because the clay texture is uneven on one side. And also because you're the only person who puts heavy rocks in water jars. Still, community kindness held everything together. Pots, households, workshops, even social ties. In places where wind could erase footprints by afternoon, people learned to hold onto whatever stayed. Let's drift now to the market days. Pots were traded along quiet roads that followed the Nile's slower bends. Vendors spread their wares in tidy rows, not because they believed in aesthetic minimalism, but because sandstorms hated disorganization. A scattered pottery layout would be a disaster within minutes of a strong gust. Rows meant efficiency. Rows meant less chasing runaway bowls. Shoppers approached the pottery stalls the same way people approach fruit stands today, picking up items, tapping them, pretending they knew what they were doing. Oh yes, this one has a good ring, someone might murmur, having absolutely no idea what constituted a good ring. But potters indulged them. Selling was part performance. Some buyers even had preferences based on kiln cooling marks. Slow-cooled pots occasionally showed subtle color gradations. These weren't special in any technical sense, but humans have been convinced by pretty patterns since the dawn of time. So potters shrugged and priced them a little higher. By evening, merchants packed up what remained and carried their unsold pots home. There, another cycle began. New clay soaking, old tools being repaired, a kiln swept of charcoal dust. Work persisted, slow and steady, like the river beside them. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just an ancient rhythm that fit the land. All of this quiet practicality kept pots functional in a harsh landscape. It also produced ceramic traditions that lasted centuries without dramatic change. In many ways, the durability of Nubian pottery wasn't just in the clay. It was in the mindset. Accept the elements. Work with them, not against them. Keep the kiln cool where it must be cool. Keep the hearth warm where it must be warm. And always keep your windbreak wall tall enough to keep the day's ambitions from blowing away. Let's drift a bit more into the night now, because we're approaching the kind of artisans who took firing control to another level entirely. As we move deeper into the slow hum of ancient Nubia, we drift toward a group of potters who operated a little farther north, closer to the edges where Egyptian influence blended into local habits. These artisans gained a quiet reputation as kiln whisperers. Not because they communed with spirits, though outsiders occasionally assumed something mystical was happening, but because they somehow maintained steady, low-stress firings even when the winds behaved like bored desert gods flicking sand at anyone who dared to build a fire. Their workshops were small, tucked behind thick mud brick walls that looked slightly slanted, as if the wind had tried to push them over several times and the walls simply refused to move. Archaeologists love to debate whether those walls were intentionally angled for aerodynamics or simply the result of hasty construction. But either way, they stood their ground. And behind them, the kilns glowed with that soft, controlled heat that made even seasoned potters shake their heads in admiration. The kiln whisperers' trick wasn't a secret so much as an attitude. They approached every firing with the calm of people who had been dealing with sandstorms since childhood and had decided long ago that they simply would not be bullied by the weather. Their cooling techniques were especially impressive. Instead of waiting for the kiln to overheat before adjusting anything, like most potters did, they made subtle corrections long before trouble arrived. It's the pottery equivalent of sensing the tiniest change in a room's mood and adjusting your conversational tone before things get awkward. This predictive calm likely came from experience passed down quietly, generation to generation. No manuals, no diagrams, just a grandmother muttering something like, "If the wind smells sharp today, stack your fuel on the left," and everyone understanding exactly what that meant. The kiln whisperers trusted those small signs. It kept their pots from cracking. It kept their workshops peaceful. And it probably kept many arguments within their families to a minimum, because nothing brings out tension quite like a ruined load of pottery. Let's float a little closer to their process. A firing day started with the same dawn quiet that potters across Nubia knew well. But while other workshops hesitated, watching the horizon to decide how much wind might come barreling in, the kiln whisperers simply got started. They soaked their fuel, mainly dried brush and cattle dung, just enough to slow the burn. A strange choice to anyone untrained. But slowing the ignition gave them more control in the first crucial minutes. Their kilns were built lower than usual too. Short, wide, sturdy. The wind couldn't get a good grip on them. The openings were narrow, almost stingy. A stranger might think the potters were hoarding the fire. Really, they were limiting the desert's ability to interfere. In the long run, this design meant fewer scorch marks, fewer shocking temperature spikes, and a much smoother cooling cycle when the firing was over. People from neighboring settlements occasionally dropped by just to watch. They'd sit on flat stones nearby, leaning against walls, trying to figure out how the kiln whisperers managed such serene firings. But the process looked so understated that most left none the wiser. There were no dramatic bellows, no frantic fan waving, no cursing at embers. Just steady hands tending steady flames. One technique that stood out, though, was their use of layered fuel beds. Before placing pots inside the kiln, the potters created thin layers of different combustibles. Faster-burning materials sat near the center, where pots needed quick bursts of heat to start the cycle. Slower-burning materials were placed closer to the vents, regulating airflow and evening out the temperature gradient. It was basically a slow-release heat system, long before anyone invented thermostats. This careful layering also meant the kiln cooled from the inside out rather than the outside in. Most kilns lose heat unevenly, causing pots near the walls to cool faster. Thermal shock often follows, leaving potters with fragments instead of vessels. But the kiln whisperers seem to have solved this centuries before the rest of the region caught on. Cooling mattered even more than heating. The desert got hot fast, but it also shed its heat quickly at dusk. So if the pots cooled too abruptly, they cracked. The kiln whisperers managed to prevent this with something deceptively simple. They created temporary insulation. They draped wet cloths over the kiln exterior. Not soaked, just damp. Enough to slow the cooling without creating steam. Cloth dried slowly in the desert air, releasing moisture in a quiet, even rhythm. It shielded the pots from sudden temperature drops. This is one of those small tricks no one writes about, but everyone remembers once they've seen it. And it's exactly the sort of humble genius that ancient craftspeople rarely get credit for. They were working scientists long before the word scientist existed. Now, pottery wasn't the only thing cooling in this workshop. Tempers cooled too. The kiln whisperers were known for their calm dispositions, at least according to later oral traditions. Families in the region had stories about them, gentle, slightly humorous tales about potters who could smooth over disputes simply by sitting everyone down and explaining how the kiln wouldn't operate properly if all the household energy was chaotic. It's a very ancient Nubian way of saying, "You're stressing me out and the fire can tell." Their family dynamics were simple too. No dramatic feuds. No grand betrayals. Just domestic life punctuated by clay dust, early mornings, and mild exasperation whenever someone misplaced a tool. If one of the children complained about chores, an elder would gesture toward the kiln and say something like, "Even the fire listens," which was vague enough to quiet anyone. But behind that calm exterior, their knowledge network stretched wide. Traders carried kiln whisper pots downriver and upriver. When someone bought a vessel that survived years of daily use without cracks, they remembered. They told others. Reputation spread in the quiet way good craftsmanship always does. Let's drift now into a typical afternoon in their workshop. The sun would be high. The shadows crisp. Clay dust warm underfoot. Inside the shade of the mud brick structure, the potters sat shaping vessels with a level of concentration that looked almost meditative. Their will, when they used one, was kick-powered, slow, steady. More often, they coiled vessels by hand, smoothing the walls with pebbles polished by years of use. A potter would run a thumb along the inner curve of a jar, checking the thickness by feel. Eyes half closed. Not because they were tired, but because tactile memory was more reliable than eyesight in the shifting desert light. Nearby, a younger apprentice might be struggling with a collapsing lump of clay, muttering at it as though it could be reasoned with. Potters across time have done this. Clay collapses. Potters argue with it. Nothing changes, but the ritual persists. Sometimes, a visiting merchant would arrive, shaded by a rough linen cloth over his head. He'd bring news of river fluctuations or distant markets or unusual requests, like the time a noble family supposedly wanted matching water jars with carved patterns that resembled waves. Which is amusing, because nobles often didn't fetch their own water, and the people actually carrying those jars would probably have preferred something easier to grip. But artisans oblige when they can. The kiln whisperers carved simple lines into the clay before firing the vessels, producing a wave-like motif that looked more like gentle zigzags. The noble family praised the pattern anyway, because nobles throughout history have rarely understood the crafts they commissioned. Another afternoon might bring a different task, repairing old vessels. The kiln whisperers took repairs seriously. Too seriously by some accounts. They patched cracks the size of hairlines. They reinforced rims that looked perfectly fine. Their philosophy seemed to be that containers deserved long lives. A good pot wasn't just an object. It was a companion. You didn't toss it out unless it was truly beyond saving. Broken pots, though, offered their own lessons. Kiln whisperers saved shards to analyze how faults developed. A warped rim told them the pot had dried too quickly. A fractured belly meant the wall had thinned unevenly. A strange discoloration pointed to excessive airflow. Each flaw recorded a moment of imbalance. Potters learned from them quietly, without lectures, without formality. Just observation. As dusk approached, shadows grew longer, and the workshop took on a peaceful, almost bluish glow. Most vessels had been shaped and set on mats to dry. Fuel had been arranged for tomorrow. Tools lay where they should be. The quiet at this hour wasn't restful so much as satisfied. A day accomplished. And yet, the desert always added its commentary. A gust of wind here. A swirl of dust there. A faint whistle slipping between the stacked pots. The kiln whisperers didn't mind. They knew the land didn't change to suit them. They changed to suit the land. And their pots endured because of that attitude. Let's drift a little farther into night. Because soon, we'll reach the potters who didn't just cool their kilns. They cooled their entire workshops with methods so unexpectedly clever that even modern archaeologists blink twice and say, "Wait, they did what?" As we ease deeper into this sandy, unhurried world, we glide toward a group of Nubian potters who, for reasons only partly understood, decided cooling a kiln wasn't quite enough. No, they wanted their entire workshops to stay cool. In the desert, where the sun behaved like a bored cosmic magnifying glass. And yet, they pulled it off with techniques so subtle and so practical that they feel almost modern. Their workshops sat near seasonal wadis, dry channels that only carried water during rare rains, but still close enough that morning air retained a hint of coolness. Instead of ignoring this fleeting freshness like most people would, these potters trapped it. They built low stone walls around their work area with tiny gaps at the bottom. These little openings acted like intake vents for morning breezes. Cool air slipped through early, settled inside, and stayed longer than it had any right to. By midday, the outside world baked under harsh sunlight, but the interior of these workshops remained surprisingly temperate. Not cool enough for, say, ice cream, but cool enough that clay stayed workable longer. And cool enough that everyone's mood probably improved, because extreme heat tends to turn minor irritations into existential crises. The potters took advantage of this daily cycle. By working with clay during early hours, when its moisture evaporated slowly, they ensured their vessels dried evenly. Uneven drying was a major cause of cracking. If the rim dried faster than the base, or vice versa, it created tension within the vessel walls. So the cooler workspace wasn't about comfort. It was structural strategy. Let's float toward the mid-morning routine. While many Nubian artisans paused during the worst heat, these potters extended their workday a little longer. Not dramatically, just enough to finish shaping a vessel before the clay became stubborn. A stubborn clay is like a stubborn person. Once it decides it's done cooperating, no amount of persuasion helps. Their workshop layout contributed to this serenity. Tools hung from wooden pegs driven into cool mud brick walls. Shaping stones, smoothing pebbles, and narrow carving blades sat in shallow baskets lined with reed fibers. Everything was arranged so smoothly that archaeologists later wondered whether someone with a strong aesthetic sense organized it, or whether the desert winds themselves demanded order. They also used a technique that feels almost like ancient air conditioning: evaporative cooling. They hung wet cloth strips from beams near the ceiling. As the water evaporated slowly in the dry air, it cooled the immediate area. Not dramatically, but enough to soften the brightness of midday. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't fancy, but it was clever. And clever counted. Let's drift to the clay preparation area. Here, large clay jars held water fetched from nearby wells or riverbanks. But instead of keeping these jars in the sun, the potters tucked them against shady walls. They even placed small damp mats beneath them so rising moisture added a little more coolness to the space. Again, nothing extreme, just subtle environmental manipulation. You could almost imagine someone centuries later trying to reconstruct these workshops and thinking, why does everything feel so balanced? Because it was. Every choice reinforced the next. It's the kind of design thinking people brag about today, except these potters never bragged about anything. They just kept making pots. Now let's float over to the kilns. Their cooling methods were even more controlled. While other potters relied on windbreaks or insulation, this group embraced airflow, managed airflow, not chaotic airflow. They built small channels around the kiln base, like shallow trenches that guided wind beneath the structure. These channels allowed tiny currents to circulate under the kiln floor, cooling it just enough to prevent hotspots. It's a little like giving the kiln its own ventilation system. On firing days, potters watched how smoke rose from the vents. Slow, graceful smoke meant ideal temperatures. Harsh, fast smoke meant heat was rising too sharply. They'd adjust tiny bricks along the air channels, shifting airflow with the patience of someone playing a very slow game of strategy. Observing these adjustments was probably hypnotic. A potter would crouch beside the kiln, consider the wind, lift a brick with 2 fingers, rotate it slightly, and set it down again. Nothing rushed. Nothing forced. Just a calm conversation between person and fire. Their cooling cycle after a firing relied on gradually restricting airflow. Instead of sealing the kiln abruptly, they added soft barriers, woven mats, loose clay plaques, even bundles of reeds. These coverings didn't completely block the vents. They just slowed everything down, like putting a cozy blanket over a tired fire. This controlled cooling meant vessels inside rarely cracked. Even delicate ones, thin-walled bowls and fine-rimmed jars, survived. Households treasured these pieces. A single jar could remain in circulation for decades, passed from grandparents to parents to children. By the time archaeologists found them, some pots had so many repair marks that they looked like patchwork quilts. Let's drift closer to their daily life. These potters weren't isolated. They lived in small clusters of homes, often sharing walls or courtyards. Children ran between workshops, carrying tools or water, or sometimes accomplishing nothing except tracking sand everywhere. Adults talked while working, speaking in tones so calm they could lull a visiting traveler to sleep. Their conversations rarely escalated. There's something about spending your life controlling fire that teaches you patience. Meals were simple. Lentils, millet, maybe roasted barley. People ate together at midday, often inside the cooler workshop rather than outside. Small clay bowls were passed around, bowls that might have been made by the very hands holding them. There's something lovely about that cyclical relationship. You make vessels, and the vessels make your daily life easier, which in turn makes you better at making vessels. Now let's drift toward the social side of workshop cooling. Because these potters didn't invent these techniques in isolation. Families intermarried between settlements. Knowledge passed through marriages, through friendships, through gentle conversations during long afternoons. When a daughter married into another village, she carried techniques with her. When an uncle visited cousins upriver, he came home with a new trick for smoothing rims or aligning vents. Cooling methods spread gradually, like water soaking into clay. Over generations, techniques blended. Some villages adopted the air channels. Others adopted the damp cloths. A few developed hybrid systems, using evaporative cooling inside and airflow cooling outside. But the workshop we're drifting around now was known for combining the two in the most seamless way. Visitors stepping inside felt an immediate shift in temperature. Not dramatic, just a soft drop. A gentle relief. Enough to make someone sigh without meaning to. Let's float now to a late afternoon scene. The sun sits low. Shadows stretch long across the packed earth. Most of the day's vessels sit arranged on mats, their surfaces drying with the evenness only a well-cooled workshop can provide. In the corner, someone smooths the edge of a jar with a quartz pebble. The rhythmic motion scrapes softly, like a whisper. Across the room, another potter checks a drying bowl by lightly tapping its rim. A bell-like sound rings out, soft, crisp, faintly metallic. It's the sound of clay turning into something more. Outside, wind stirs a small sand swirl that dances for a few seconds before collapsing. Inside, nothing stirs except hands moving, tools shifting, cloths swaying gently with the air currents. Even the kiln seems calmer here. The day's heat bleeds from it quietly. Someone has already placed the reed bundles for controlled cooling. Soon, the kiln will soften into a dull glow, and by dawn, everything inside will be cool enough to reveal. This cooling method gave their pottery an odd reputation for lasting longer. Not magical longevity, just durability. When archaeologists compare pottery across regions, the vessels from these cooled workshops usually show fewer signs of thermal fractures, fewer microcracks, straighter rims, more consistent wall thickness. If pots could brag, these ones would quietly, politely. Let's drift into evening now. People light small oil lamps. Conversations grow softer. The last bits of daylight fade from the workshop walls. Someone checks tomorrow's clay supply. Someone else sweeps the floor with a smooth, practiced motion. Night comes gently, and there, under the cooling desert sky, the workshop stays serene, cooler than the land around it. A small pocket of comfort carved out by generations of practical, patient potters who refused to accept that desert heat was an excuse for mediocre firing. Their cooling methods would influence potters downriver. Their designs would echo into later centuries. And their calm, breezy workshops became tiny havens in a harsh landscape, proving that sometimes the quietest innovations last the longest. Next, we'll drift to the potters who didn't just cool their workshops. They transformed the desert wind itself into part of their craft. As we glide deeper into the soft, evening quiet of ancient Nubian life, we arrive at one of the most quietly brilliant traditions in the ceramic world: workshops that cooled themselves. Not magically, not with forgotten machines, just with engineering so subtle that you wouldn't notice it unless you spent a full day inside, listening to the way air moved across clay. These potters lived in a region where the desert heat didn't simply exist, it insisted on being noticed. Afternoon sun could push temperatures high enough to make clay dry unevenly within minutes. And nothing frustrates a potter more than a vessel cracking because one side decided to dry like a lazy lizard while the other dried like it was sprinting across the sand. So these artisans built workshops designed to keep everything in balance, including their own sanity. The structures themselves looked unremarkable at first glance. Just mud brick walls, domed roofs, and small doorways that made visitors duck in a slightly undignified way. But once you stepped inside, the air felt different. Cooler. Not chilly, just pleasantly moderated, like stepping under the shade of a tree on a heat-struck afternoon. The secret rested in airflow channels carved directly into the walls. Narrow slits angled downward from high on the outer face to low on the inner face. Hot desert air passing over the exterior was drawn down and cooled as it slid across shaded brick, entering the room in thin, controlled streams. It wasn't enough airflow to disturb drying pottery, but it kept the temperature steady. And in a place where steady meant your pots survive today, that mattered. Imagine a potter sitting cross-legged near one of these channels, smoothing a coil seam on a water jar. She could feel the faint movement of air brushing her arm, subtle enough that she wouldn't comment on it, but constant enough that her workshop didn't turn into a kiln of its own. The desert outside might be blistering. Inside, her workspace hovered in that calm middle ground where clay behaved predictably. This cooling strategy was practical, but it also reflected a deeper mindset, one that accepted the desert's power and redirected it rather than fighting it. These potters weren't blocking heat, they were negotiating with it. Let's drift closer to their daily rhythm. Mornings began with slow preparation. Not because potters were lazy, but because rushing clay at dawn made no sense. The clay was cool. Their hands were cool. The air was calm. So they prepared slip, kneaded fresh batches, and checked yesterday's drying vessels. Children sometimes padded in half asleep, carrying small baskets of chaff to be mixed into the clay body. Elders offered uninvited but always correct advice. Don't place that bowl in the corner. The airflow is soft there. It'll dry slow. Smooth the rim a touch more. The heat later will pull it even. None of this was criticism. It was simply the language of a craft community that lived inside its materials. Gentle corrections. Soft words. A steady rhythm of making. When the sun climbed and the heat pressed against the walls, the potters kept shaping vessels because their workshop remained forgiving. They could take their time. Coiled vessels rose slowly under their fingers. Thumb pots spun into shape with small, circular motions. The air brushed past them in those faint, regulated currents, keeping the clay damp enough that it didn't betray them. Gentle predictability, an artisan's dream. Meanwhile, outside, the wind flung sand at everything without the slightest sense of courtesy. But inside, the pots rested. Shelves were lined with bowls turned upside down, their bases lifting slightly on small clay spacers to allow even airflow. Jars leaned on wooden racks. Plates dried flat on mats woven from river reeds. Every piece had a place where the air would reach it equally. That was the whole point. But what really impressed visiting potters wasn't the airflow design. It was the floor. The workshop floors were packed with a mixture of clay, ash, and crushed ceramic fragments from old broken pottery. This created a firm surface that absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, like the ancient equivalent of thermal buffering. When the air outside swung from scorching midday to rapid evening cooling, the workshop floor held a steady temperature. It kept drying vessels from undergoing abrupt thermal shocks. Nothing inside the workshop experienced extremes. That was the beauty. If a clay figurine cracked, it cracked quietly from user error, not temperature tantrums. If a jar warped, it happened because someone shaped it unevenly, not because a hot gust had blasted the workshop at the wrong moment. And if a potter complained that her piece looked slightly off, elders responded with the gentle dry humor of people who had heard every complaint for 30 generations. Maybe it's the pot, they'd say. Maybe it's your attitude today. Another cooling strategy lived overhead. Many workshops used double-layered ceilings, two thin domes with an open space between them. Hot air collected in the upper dome, while the lower dome insulated the workspace. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't complex. But it worked. The hot air drifted upward and outward while the potters shaped bowls, sketched lines, tapped bases, and trimmed coils. Some days, the upper dome popped from heat expansion. Little cracking sounds echoed faintly through the workshop, like tiny pebbles settling. No one panicked. Everyone had heard it before. The roof wasn't collapsing. It was just sighing. By mid-afternoon, when the desert was at its worst, the potters usually shifted tasks. They didn't fire kills at this hour, too risky, too unpredictable. Instead, they focused on decoration. Slip painting, incised lines, fingertip impressions, soft rhythmic tapping against leather-hard surfaces. You could almost hear the pattern. Tap, tap, smooth, brush, tap, brush, pause. A child might wander in and ask why patterns mattered. An elder would answer with an explanation that sounded philosophical but was really just practical. People remember the pots they can recognize. Patterns weren't decoration. They were branding. Some motifs were inherited from the Egyptian north. Others came from local Nubian traditions, zigzags, dotted ridges, stylized river lines. Some potters achieved delicate geometric precision, carefully carving repeating shapes with a sharpened reed. Others opted for gentle asymmetry that matched the slow curves of their vessels. All of it dried evenly thanks to the controlled air. Late afternoon brought the gentle bustle of pre-firing preparation. Fuel stacks were checked. Kiln entrances were cleared. Tools were arranged in neat clusters: scrapers, smoothing stones, brushes, long wooden paddles used for adjusting vessel placement inside the kiln. Firing itself usually happened at night, when the desert's cooling made heat easier to manage. Inside the cooled workshop, potters rested. Or tried to. Some wandered in and out, checking dried vessels, or sitting quietly near airflow channels, enjoying the gentle whisper of moving air. Sometimes two potters would sit in companionable silence, smoothing small figurines or rubbing slip across a pot surface. The air stayed even. The desert outside softened. Stars rose. Kilns glowed orange against the night. And still, the workshop remained cool. Even after firing, when potters returned with faces warm from the kiln's heat, the workshop offered relief. They could set newly fired pots inside to cool slowly without fear of cracking. The whole building functioned like a partner in the craft, moderating temperature when human control wasn't enough. Travelers who visited these communities often tried to describe the sensation of entering such a workshop. They spoke of cool shadows and soft air and rooms that felt patient. None of those descriptions are technical, but they capture the essence. These cooling workshops weren't inventions so much as extensions of pottery philosophy. Keep everything steady, calm, predictable. No drama, no extremes. Just the slow balance of materials and climate. Stories from the region suggest that some potters even named their workshops. Not formally, but affectionately. A little like people today naming their cars. Names that meant cool shelter, or quiet place, or the soft air room. These weren't superstitious gestures. They reflected gratitude toward structures that helped pots survive the desert. Repair work happened here too. A pot needing reinforcement would be placed near the airflow without being blasted by it. Resin patches dried gently. Clay plugs settled. Fibers tightened along seams. Even the repairs benefited from the controlled climate. And when elders told stories, they often mentioned how their own teachers had worked in the same rooms, feeling the same cooled air on their arms while shaping thick-rimmed jars or slender spouted vessels. The continuity stretched back generations. The cooling channels and multi-layer ceilings weren't temporary experiments. They were inherited solutions, refined slowly over centuries. They stayed because they worked. As night deepened and the workshop dimmed, the potters often sat together, enjoying the gently moderated air that made their craft possible. Clay dust settled. Tools rested. The cooling channels whispered. And above them, the double-layered dome sighed again as it adjusted to the desert's cooling. Soon, we'll drift toward another group entirely, potters who built their kilns partially underground, borrowing the planet's own steady temperatures to keep their firings cool and calm. As we drift farther into the dunes and the soft, velvety quiet of ancient Nubian evenings, we reach a cluster of artisans whose workshops behaved a little differently from everyone else's. Not louder, not bigger, just calmer. Even on nights when the desert stayed hot long after sunset, those shimmering evenings when the ground itself breathed warmth like a sleeping animal, these potters kept their workspaces surprisingly cool. Modern archaeologists found traces of their installations and collectively tilted their heads, as if trying to decode a riddle written by someone who didn't particularly want it decoded. Because these potters weren't just keeping kilns cool, they were keeping the entire workshop environment mild enough that clay stored overnight didn't dry out, warp, or crumble. And they managed all this without water-wasting systems or fancy architecture. Let's settle into the shadows of their workshop, the way the desert night settles over everything it touches. Inside, the air felt different. Cooler, smoother, not as prickly as the rest of the region. Clay vessels rested in orderly rows. Drying boards lined the interior walls. The ground was packed flat, sprinkled with fine sand, not enough to disrupt clay, but enough to soften footsteps. It made the space feel almost hushed, like a library built for pottery. The potters here understood something that rarely gets credited in textbooks. Nighttime heat retention could be just as much of an enemy as daytime scorching. Clay needed rest. Clay needed slow moisture loss. Clay needed consistency. And the desert was not known for its emotional stability. It cooled too fast. Then it stayed hot too long. Then it shifted again. Like a moody teenager sweeping from one feeling to the next with no warning whatsoever. So the potters built multi-layer roofs. Nothing extravagant. Just layers of reed mats, separated by thin air pockets. Each mat acted like a breathable shield. Air flowed between them. Heat left slowly. Coolness stayed a bit longer. The ceiling essentially became an ancient Nubian version of an insulated thermos, just a lot less shiny and significantly more susceptible to termites. Archaeologists didn't realize what they were looking at until they found burned mat fragments sandwiched between roof debris. The layering was intentional, smart, practical, not glamorous enough to be celebrated, but effective enough to be copied by neighboring workshops over the following generations. Now, let's drift deeper into the evening routine. While other potters left their workshops at dusk and returned at dawn, these artisans often stayed late. Not working heavily, just tending, observing, guiding. Clay wasn't left alone. Not because it needed affection, though if you asked a seasoned potter they might claim clay behaves better when someone's keeping an eye on it. Really, the late hours allowed them to monitor humidity shifts. Here's where the ingenuity shows. Instead of using water basins inside the workshop, which would have evaporated too quickly to help, they placed large porous jars along the shaded outer walls of the building. Not inside. Outside. This sounds counterintuitive until you imagine the airflow. Night winds in Nubia often sweep low across the dunes. As the breeze hit the jars, the evaporating moisture cooled the wall. The wall, in turn, cooled the air on the interior side of it. The process was slow and subtle, more like ambient temperature persuasion than actual cooling, but it worked. The whole workshop maintained a soft, even coolness long into the night. People today would call it passive climate control. The potters probably called it just how we do things. Inside, the potters sat cross-legged on leather mats, smoothing rims with damp fingertips. The clay felt different at night, more cooperative. The darkness softened its texture, made it behave as though the heat of the day had never touched it. Apprentices learned to recognize these nighttime conditions early. Clay sleeps now, an elder might murmur. Which wasn't mystical, just practical. Sleeping clay, clay that's cooled evenly, was less likely to surprise you with cracks the next morning. Another quiet brilliance in this workshop was the storage pits. Not deep pits, just shallow depressions lined with woven grass that held unused clay in gently humid conditions. When covered with an upturned bowl or lid, the clay stayed workable for days. In a landscape where everything dried too quickly, this was borderline miraculous. Some archaeologists used to assume the depressions were for food storage, or ritual offerings, or something symbolic, because that's the academic catch-all for anything not immediately obvious. But the wear patterns showed scraping marks consistent with pulling out clay. The pits were workspaces, not shrines. And the potters using them simply understood that climate control wasn't just about cooling kills, it was about cooling everything. Let's drift into a typical late-night scene. A single oil lamp glows in the corner, its flame steady, not flickering. That's another sign of the workshop's clever design. The airflow inside was so stable, so controlled, that the lamp barely moved. There's a gentle rustle as a mat shifts, a whisper of clay as it's cut with a taut string, a soft exhale, a faint rhythmic smoothing as someone rubs a pebble around the belly of a half-made jar. It's not hard to imagine these potters speaking in low tones, nothing urgent, nothing heated. The wind comes from the west tonight, someone might murmur. The jars will cool well, another answers. Then the conversation fades, not because they've run out of things to say, but because silence is part of the craft. Sound affects concentration. Concentration affects hand pressure. And one unnecessary thumbprint could ruin an entire day's effort. Occasionally, someone outside the community visited to purchase goods. They'd arrive at twilight, carrying wrapped bundles of dates or small amounts of barley to trade. They'd peer into the workshop gently, as though expecting to see some ritual they weren't supposed to witness. And in a way, they were witnessing a ritual, but one of patience, not mysticism. The potters welcomed visitors, though usually with quiet nods rather than enthusiastic greetings. The atmosphere of the workshop made loud voices feel inappropriate, like someone shouting inside a cool library where jars were busy dreaming. Let's drift toward the kiln at this late hour. Even when not in use, it still radiated the residual heat of earlier firings. But the potters had a trick for keeping it from warming the whole workshop. They built small wind tunnels, simple channels carved through the ground or between bricks that allowed stray heat to vent out of the kiln area and dissipate into the cooler night air. This seems small, almost trivial, until you imagine how quickly stored heat can spread in a closed space. But the kiln whisperers of earlier chapters worked with active firing winds. This group worked with resting heat, the quiet, lingering warmth that most workshops simply accepted. They didn't accept it. They guided it, redirected it, convinced it to leave politely. The result? Cooler rooms, better clay, longer working hours, and fewer cracked vessels during morning checks. Some nights, they even used the residual kiln heat to gently warm stored clay, not enough to dry it, but enough to keep it supple. They placed baskets near but not touching the kiln. Think of it as a pottery version of letting dough rise near a warm oven, only inverted. Warmth wasn't encouraging growth, but preventing the clay from stiffening. By midnight, the workshop hummed at a low, nearly unchanging temperature. A rare achievement, a human-made microclimate in the middle of a landscape known for extremes. Let's float into that near-midnight silence. Outside, the dunes rise and fall like sleeping forms. Stars flicker overhead, bright but distant. A faint desert breeze brushes the outer walls. Inside, everything holds still. Potters pause their work. Tools rest. Clay rests. The entire space feels suspended in a moment of perfect balance. Cool enough to breathe, warm enough to stay awake, quiet enough that every breath sounds meaningful. And through that calm, you can sense why these potters stayed up at night. The world was gentler then. The air kinder. The clay more forgiving. Problems could be solved with a slow exhale and a smooth thumb stroke. Chapter 9, River Whispers, Kiln Shadows, and the Quiet Triumph of Shape. By the time we reach the 9th chapter of our drifting journey through Nubian pottery, the rhythm of the workshops has become almost hypnotic. Kilns no longer appear as separate entities. They are extensions of the potters themselves, breathing and pulsing in tandem with the sun, the wind, and the slow rise and fall of the Nile. Potters had long since realized that controlling clay was only half the challenge. The other half was negotiating with nature itself, and nature, as it happens, is a stubborn coworker. The river, which seems gentle at first glance, dictates more of a potter's day than the sun ever could. In early mornings, when the light is soft and the water reflects the pale lavender sky, potters might glance toward the current, noting subtle ripples that indicate wind direction or sand deposition upstream. Tiny changes in the riverbank's edge, barely noticeable to anyone else, signaled whether they could safely source new clay, or if they needed to wait until the next high tide. These observations were slow, almost meditative, requiring patience that would exhaust anyone used to modern schedules. Evenings were particularly fascinating. The river would calm, reflecting stars as if it had decided to play celestial mimicry. Kilns, meanwhile, retained the heat of the day in a gentle gradient, allowing cooled vessels to settle without cracking. Potters would walk among them, hands brushing against rough surfaces, listening to the subtle hum of the drying clay. No sound could be louder than necessary, silence preserved their craft. Not every potter approached this rhythm with grace. Some were impatient, trying to accelerate drying by moving vessels closer to open air or stacking them hastily in the wind. Such mistakes usually resulted in slightly warped bowls or hairline fractures, which became lessons for both the artisan and the apprentice. The kiln itself seemed to enforce patience. It demanded attention, but never urgency. It reminded everyone, day after day, that speed was the enemy of good pottery. Let's drift to another feature often overlooked, the role of small domestic animals in the pottery workshops. Goats, chickens, and occasionally dogs were present in nearly every village. They wandered quietly through the sand, occasionally sniffing at clay or investigating fired pots. The best potters learned to coexist with them, placing fragile vessels out of reach and tolerating the occasional curious nudge. The animal's presence added a layer of unpredictability, softening the rigidity of the craft and reminding the artisan that even the calmest day contains gentle surprises. Apprenticeships were particularly interesting in this chapter of the story. Younger potters often learned by observing, by mimicking gestures, and by absorbing the cadence of older hands shaping clay. Words were minimal. Most instruction came from shared rhythm and timing. An elder might nudge a vessel subtly or reposition it with quiet precision, and the apprentice would understand. These lessons were slow, patient, and repetitive, which made them perfect for the quiet, sleep-inducing environment of a pottery district. Every motion repeated until it became instinct, until the potter and the clay seemed to act as one entity. Let's float now into ceremonial and ritual considerations. Certain vessels were destined for temples, for offerings, or for river festivals. These pots required meticulous preparation. The clay needed additional kneading, the surfaces smoother, the shapes more balanced. Even minor asymmetry could be interpreted as inauspicious, so potters adjusted with care. In some cases, they polished the vessels with stones for hours, pressing gently to achieve the perfect sheen. The process was slow, almost contemplative, and seemed designed to soothe as much as to produce functionally sound pottery. Trades and exchanges also wove into this quiet tapestry. Small boats would arrive along the Nile, loaded with grains, dyes, or exotic materials. Potters would receive requests for particular shapes, sizes, or finishes. A wealthy family might demand a large water jar with symmetrical curves and a polished surface. Traders' expectations were often exaggerated, but potters met them with careful diligence. The satisfaction was never loud or dramatic. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the work had endured another test of scrutiny. And now, let's consider a subtle element often forgotten: temperature management. While fire control was essential, controlling ambient heat and coolness was equally critical. Potters observed sun patterns across the day, noting how long shadows lingered across walls and how the sand retained warmth into the evening. Kilns were positioned not only for airflow but for optimal exposure to gradual temperature changes, preventing cracks or warping. The placement of unfinished vessels on mats, racks, or simply flat stones had as much impact as the firing process itself. Let's drift further into minor catastrophes, small mishaps that didn't ruin an artisan's day but offered lessons anyway. A sudden gust of wind might deposit fine sand on semi-dried clay, creating faint texture lines that, while technically flaws, were often appreciated aesthetically. A pet might nudge a half-formed jar, forcing the potter to recalibrate its walls. Children learning the craft might press too hard, creating subtle bulges or dents. All of these minor events were accepted calmly. They were gentle reminders of life's variability, integrated into the slow rhythm of production. And of course, the social dimension persisted. Potters frequently gathered to exchange tips or compare techniques, though the gatherings were quiet, restrained. Nobody shouted or gesticulated dramatically. Instead, they demonstrated through hand movements, repositioning a vessel, or tilting a small jar to illustrate a principle of heat distribution. Advice was given softly: shift this layer slightly, or add more straw here, or leave it to dry overnight. The calmness preserved the meditative environment. By nightfall, the village workshops settled into the final stage of daily practice. Kilns retained gentle residual heat, the river reflected moonlight, and the sand, smoothed by days of activity, captured faint patterns of footprints and tool marks. Potters cleaned their spaces, stacking tools neatly, sometimes running water over mats to prevent the next day's clay from sticking. They prepared fuel for the following day, kneaded fresh clay in small quantities, and arranged partially dried vessels in protective patterns. One can imagine the slow conversation of the wind through the kilns at night, carrying soft reminders of how each vessel had been fired, each curve shaped, each wall thickened or thinned with care. Even the shadows of the kilns seemed alive in their own gentle way, stretching across sand like quiet hands, reminding the artisans of continuity. The pottery that survived this process, bowls, jars, and cups, carried within them the patient rhythms of many hands and many quiet decisions. Finally, we drift into reflection. Kilns, vessels, apprentices, winds, rivers, all parts of a long, slow, intricate cycle. The success of each day was measured not in loud acclaim but in subtle endurance. Pots that survived the firing, walls that didn't crack, surfaces that remained smooth. And the potters themselves, calm and patient, moved gently through the cycles, aware that their craft, while ordinary, was also extraordinary in its longevity and quiet mastery. By the end of the evening, as the moon's reflection deepened on the Nile, everything rested. Kilns cooled fully. Dust settled. Tools were stowed. And the river, ever patient, continued its gentle flow, echoing the steady heartbeat of a community that had learned to move at the pace of wind, sand, and clay. A rhythm so quiet and consistent that it could almost lull anyone observing it into a slow, calm sense of timelessness. And so, as the potters drifted toward their own rest, the vessels they had shaped and fired sat quietly beside them, testaments to patience, observation, and the unhurried art of enduring craft. The river, the wind, and the desert itself seemed to acknowledge this quiet triumph, whispering in gentle, sandy tones, carrying forward the knowledge of kiln, clay, and hands that had learned to speak without raising a voice. By the 10th chapter of our slowly drifting exploration, the rhythm of Nubian pottery has settled into something almost hypnotic. Kilns are no longer just ovens, they are instruments of patient negotiation with wind, sun, and sand. Clay is no longer just raw material, it is a collaborator shaping itself to the hands of artisans who have learned to listen rather than rush. And quietly, in most households, pots weren't just vessels, they were daily companions. A large water jar sat in the corner, its curved belly keeping cool water accessible for women, children, and laborers. Cooking pots rested near fire pits, blackened bottoms testifying to countless stews and soups prepared over the years. Smaller bowls held grains, legumes, or dried fruit. Even ceremonial vessels might be tucked in a niche, waiting for festival day or ritual offering. Every pot had its place, its function, and its subtle story. Potters, through their careful observation of how vessels were used, held a quiet authority within these domestic systems. They knew which pot would best serve the household's needs. They could suggest slight adjustments in shape or thickness to accommodate a particularly awkward fire pit or a family with unusually large hands. Sometimes, they even advised on storage, how to arrange jars so that airflow reduced spoilage, how to keep grains dry, or how to minimize cracking during seasonal shifts. These suggestions were never forceful. No one shouted, and no advice came with exaggerated gestures. Instead, the potter might tilt a jar slightly, tap its surface, or nod toward the sun's angle through a window. Observant family members absorbed the information quietly, adjusting practices with minimal fuss. The potter's influence was subtle, gentle, and remarkably effective. Authority exercised softly, without drama. Ceremonial pottery added another layer of quiet complexity. Festivals, harvest offerings, and river-related rituals required vessels crafted with intention. Some had small ridges or indentations designed for ritual pouring. Others had faint linear motifs meant to echo river currents or the horizon. These details were not for display but for precision in action. Pouring offerings incorrectly, or using the wrong vessel, could be considered disrespectful. The potter's careful hands ensured these subtle requirements were met, keeping both ritual and social harmony intact. Let's drift into market interactions for a moment. Traders arriving from distant settlements often requested ceremonial vessels. Payment wasn't always immediate, and negotiations were conducted with calm patience. A potter would rarely express frustration, even if a trader haggled over hours. Instead, the conversation moved slowly, deliberately, with measured phrases. "This vessel has taken 2 days of shaping and careful firing," or "the rim has been balanced for gentle pouring." These soft statements conveyed value without confrontation. Interestingly, households often participated in these ceremonies by contributing pottery themselves. Small offerings, like jars of beer or grains, required vessels that were functional, aesthetically consistent, and reliable. Households learned to coordinate with local potters, ensuring that their vessels met both practical and ritual standards. This collaboration reinforced social bonds and strengthened the subtle authority of skilled potters, who became custodians not just of clay, but of ceremonial knowledge. Apprentices observed all of this quietly, absorbing not only shaping and firing skills but also the soft power dynamics of household and ritual life. They learned how to speak minimally yet effectively, how to adjust a vessel without drawing attention, and how to anticipate needs before anyone voiced them. By participating in these routines, apprentices internalized the rhythm of domestic and ceremonial life, understanding that good pottery was inseparable from calm, attentive social engagement. The river continued to influence everything. Its levels dictated clay collection, firing schedules, and ceremonial timing. High floods might delay harvest festivals, requiring potters to adjust production or prepare vessels ahead of schedule. Low floods exposed richer clay, providing opportunities to craft finer vessels. Observing these natural rhythms required patience and subtlety, qualities essential to both craftsmanship and social interaction. Even small domestic challenges were intertwined with pottery. Children learning to pour from heavy jars, animals brushing against drying vessels, and shifting weather conditions all demanded attention. Potters responded with calm adjustments. moving a jar slightly, reinforcing a rim, or reminding an apprentice to be gentle. These interventions were never dramatic. They were part of a continuous, unhurried dialogue between human, vessel, and environment. Trade and social mobility also intersected gently. A skilled potter could gain recognition beyond their village, not through showmanship, but through quiet excellence. Traders would carry durable, finely shaped jars along the Nile, introducing distant communities to the work of a particular artisan. This slow reputation building reinforced social influence without the need for public accolades or formal titles. Potters became respected figures through consistency, patience, and the subtle reliability of their craft. Even mundane repairs carried ceremonial and social significance. A cracked vessel, carefully mended with straw or resin, preserved both functionality and aesthetic continuity. Families relied on these repaired vessels for everyday use, ensuring continuity in household routines. The act of repair also reinforced respect for the potter's skill. Small interventions that restored balance and utility without dramatic attention, quietly maintaining social cohesion. By nightfall, workshops and households aligned in rhythm. Kilns retained residual warmth, drying vessels gradually and gently. Apprentices and potters cleaned tools, prepared clay for the next day, and arranged mats to protect partially dried jars. Households placed ceremonial vessels in protected niches, ready for early morning rituals or seasonal festivals. The river reflected moonlight across the village, and the wind whispered through mud brick walls, carrying subtle messages of continuity and calm. The cumulative effect of these slow, attentive practices was remarkable. Pottery became more than utilitarian objects. It embodied patience, observation, and social harmony. The work required technical skill, yes, but also an understanding of rhythm, subtle authority, and gentle human interaction. In a sense, each vessel carried within it the calm, steady hand of the potter, the patience of generations, and the quiet whispers of domestic, ceremonial, and natural forces. And as the night deepened, as stars glimmered on the surface of the Nile and the desert wind settled into its gentle murmur, the workshops rested. Kilns cooled. Tools were stowed. Clay waited. Apprentices drifted into sleep beside the soft hum of drying vessels. And the community, whole and interconnected, rested in quiet satisfaction, knowing that another day of shaping, firing, and gentle negotiation had passed successfully, and that tomorrow, the rhythm would resume, unhurried, patient, and enduring. The annual flooding of the Nile was perhaps the most influential factor. High waters deposited rich clay along the riverbanks, but they also inundated usual working areas, requiring potters to adjust schedules. During these months, clay had to be sourced from alternative locations, often farther from the village, requiring careful planning and patience. Apprentices would accompany elders to these sites, observing how seasoned hands selected the best materials. Clay that was neither too sandy nor too coarse, with just enough moisture to ensure pliability but not so much that shaping became cumbersome. Low water periods presented different challenges. Clay might be more compacted or interspersed with coarse sand, demanding extra kneading and refinement. Potters would often soak clay for extended periods, sometimes overnight, to achieve the right consistency. This soaking wasn't hurried. It followed a quiet rhythm, allowing the clay to relax and respond more predictably to shaping. The process itself was meditative, hands pressing, folding, and observing, creating a dialogue with the material that required patience and attentiveness. Temperature and wind patterns, too, were influenced by the seasons. Hot, dry months increased the risk of rapid drying, making vessels prone to cracking. Potters countered this by adjusting their firing schedules, sometimes firing earlier in the day to take advantage of gentle morning air or placing partially dried vessels in shaded nooks for slower drying. Conversely, cooler or more humid periods demanded careful ventilation to prevent moisture from remaining trapped inside the kiln, which could compromise the structural integrity of the pottery. The river itself acted as both collaborator and teacher. Potters observed subtle changes in current and sediment deposition, learning to anticipate how these shifts would affect clay quality. A slight alteration in the water's flow might reveal richer clay deposits or expose previously inaccessible banks. Potters internalized these cues, translating environmental observation into practical decisions that shaped both daily routines and long-term planning. Apprentices, learning through quiet observation, absorbed these lessons over seasons and years. They watched how elders assessed moisture content, soil texture, and firing readiness, learning to interpret the environment as a partner rather than a challenge. Patience, again, was central. Each subtle observation informed subsequent decisions, creating a feedback loop of quiet attentiveness that ensured both the quality of vessels and the continuity of craft knowledge. Ceremonial pottery followed the same slow, observant rhythm. Certain festivals and offerings were tied explicitly to seasonal cycles, requiring potters to anticipate the timing of rituals months in advance. Preparing vessels for these events demanded extra care, refined shaping, additional smoothing, and precise firing. Potters adjusted kiln temperatures and airflow based on anticipated seasonal humidity and wind, ensuring that ceremonial jars and bowls would endure until the day they were needed. Even the smallest vessels were part of this anticipatory system. Storage jars, water pots, and cooking vessels were all crafted with seasonal considerations in mind. Potters recognized that certain shapes or thicknesses were better suited to the extremes of heat or cold, or to the accelerated drying conditions during windy months. The integration of these subtle factors into everyday pottery practice exemplifies the slow, deliberate intelligence of Nubian artisans, a kind of quiet foresight that is easy to overlook unless one pays attention to the minutiae of their craft. Trade and community life adapted to these seasonal rhythms as well. River traders often timed their journeys according to the flood cycles, arriving when clay-rich deposits were plentiful and pottery production could meet demand. Potters coordinated with these arrivals, adjusting production schedules to ensure that vessels were ready for transportation without haste. Markets and ceremonial gatherings followed similar timing, with families preparing offerings and household vessels in alignment with environmental cues, creating a community-wide rhythm that echoed the cycles of river and desert. Minor disruptions were inevitable. Unexpected sandstorms, sudden shifts in river flow, or unseasonably high temperatures occasionally challenged the potters' plans. Yet these interruptions were met with calm adjustment rather than frustration. Partially dried vessels might be moved to sheltered areas, kilns adjusted for airflow, and apprentices redirected to knead clay or repair slightly warped jars. Each adaptation was subtle and measured, maintaining the quiet rhythm that defined Nubian pottery life. Observation extended beyond clay and kiln to encompass the broader household and social environment. Potters monitored how vessels were used, noting which designs were most practical for cooking, water storage, or ceremonial purposes. Adjustments were made based on these observations. Rims might be slightly flared for easier pouring, wall thickness altered to improve durability, or decorative lines added to indicate function or ceremonial significance. Each change was deliberate, made in response to environmental and social conditions rather than aesthetic impulse alone. Even repair practices followed seasonal awareness. Cracked or damaged vessels were often repaired using plant fibers, resins, or clay patches, techniques that required careful timing relative to humidity and temperature. Potters knew that repairs made during the dry season might set differently than those made during wetter months, and they adjusted techniques accordingly. The success of these repairs relied on patient observation and the ability to anticipate the subtle effects of environment on material properties. By evening, the workshops settled into familiar patterns. Kilns retained residual heat, vessels rested in orderly arrangements, and apprentices quietly reviewed the day's lessons. The river reflected moonlight, and the desert wind moved gently through mud brick walls. Household routines and ceremonial preparations were synchronized with environmental cues, creating a slow, harmonious rhythm that encompassed work, ritual, and daily life. In essence, seasonal rhythms infused every aspect of pottery production and use. The potter's attentiveness to river levels, wind patterns, and temperature variations exemplifies a sophisticated, anticipatory intelligence that required patience, observation, and subtle adjustment. Their craft was not only technical but profoundly relational, connecting material, environment, and community in a slow, deliberate dance that unfolded over days, weeks, and years. And so, as night deepened and the moon rose high over the Nile, the workshops rested. Clay awaited the next day's shaping. Kilns cooled gently. Tools were stowed. Apprentices drifted toward sleep, carrying the lessons of observation, patience, and subtle adaptation into dreams. The community, aligned with the seasonal rhythms of river and desert, rested in quiet satisfaction, confident that their craft, shaped by attentive hands and anticipatory minds, would endure, vessel by vessel, season by season. Kiln evolution was gradual, deliberate, and subtle. Early kilns were simple structures, short, wide, mud brick ovens designed to contain heat while resisting the desert winds. Over time, incremental improvements appeared. Some workshops added low, partial walls to divert gusts of sand. Others incorporated small internal baffles, made of fired clay or flat stones, to guide airflow and stabilize temperature. Fuel beds were layered with increasing sophistication, balancing quick-burning and slow-burning materials to maintain a consistent heat curve. Each modification was modest in appearance, but cumulative effects were profound. Fewer cracked vessels, longer-lasting fires, and a quiet confidence that each firing would succeed. Apprentices and younger potters absorbed these refinements without the need for formal manuals. Observing elders, they noted which kiln adjustments produced the most reliable,